in this next section, we're going to talk about succession in communities. And the idea of succession is basically when an area is devastated or many of the species that once lived in that community die off, they're going to be replaced ultimately by other things. And so these are some of the ecological ideas that underpin that or that underlie that idea. So parcels of land that have been abandoned by humans or devastated by physical forces will almost always be reclaimed by nature. And it almost always is a little bit loose, it's a little bit wonky. I think my opinion is they will always be reclaimed by nature. And this process is called succession. And it's a series of replacements of community members until a relatively stable final state is reached. So again, it is the destruction of a piece of land, and succession is the process by which those communities are reestablished. So primary succession proceeds from an original state of little or no life in soil that lacks nutrients. So this is going to be something that is absolutely and totally devastated. So like a pretty classical example of this is like Mount St. Helens. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. It exploded like 40 years ago now or something like that. And during this explosion, everything was destroyed. The only thing that was left over at the end was, basically lava that had dried. And so that is an example of primary succession. So primary succession, the area is absolutely decimated. So you have this exposed till because whatever went through there is just kind of exposed this underlying geology, or this is just lava that's left over. And then the first process is that you wind up having some pioneer species come in. Things like lichens, bacteria, horsetails, liverworts, things that don't need a lot. It can basically just photosynthesize and get by. And then those are replaced by slightly larger, slightly more dependent plants that maybe can use these predecessors, these pioneer species, as kind of like a foothold so that they can get into that area. Those are then replaced by larger plants, which are then replaced by larger and larger plants. And then ultimately, maybe these things will turn into ponds or maybe a bog or a region that is just more teeming with life than the exposed till. And so kind of what I want you to know is, I want you to know what primary succession is. I want you to know that it's replaced by these pioneer species. And then life just kind of gets larger and more complicated from there in this process. Secondary succession is when there is some disturbance, but life is still remaining. The soil still has nutrients. So an example of this would be like people clear cutting a region of forest, or just tilling over grasslands so they can farm, and then ultimately abandoning that region. So it's not like it's just nothing but rock and death and no life. There is still some life here, but it is a region that has been destroyed. So after succession has taken place, the final community is known as the climax community. A set of developments happen in primary succession, and these are the ones that I want you to know. So like I said earlier, you have those pioneer species, those photosynthesizers. Those photosynthesizers make it so that later species can come through and have a foothold in the region, and then ultimately those are going to competitively drive out some of the earlier species. So later species are going to drive out earlier species, and then once that community is stable with those later on species driving out whatever they need to drive out, bringing in whatever needs to be brought in, that's called your climax community. So as succession proceeds, species diversity increases within communities. Smaller, shorter-lived species tend to be replaced by larger, longer-lived species like those big trees. So the rejuvenation of Mount St. Helens that occurred in 1980 has given us a lot of information with primary and secondary succession. So there's Mount St. Helens. You can see it's just absolutely decimated everywhere around here. And years later, you can see things are beginning to grow back. Another important lesson we learned from St. Helens was that, while the models of primary and secondary succession are useful, they aren't necessarily always going to be 100% true. You have lots of intermediate things. So one of the chief lessons learned is the degree to which succession can be facilitated by these legacy species. So these things that are left over after an ecological disturbance, whether it's in a case of primary or secondary succession. So we had these survivors at Mount St. Helens. We had these little groundhogs that were underneath the ground, and they were able to survive the explosion because they were underneath the ground and they were in certain patches. So even though we call this primary succession, we did have some organisms that were left over. And because they were continuing to eat on roots and they were continuing to till and move over soils, this absolutely helped the process of succession take